Well, hello everyone. I'm Melissa Johnson, Director of Strategic Partnerships here at Aiken Technical College. And I would like to thank you for joining us today for our March Dynamic Dialogues. We are absolutely thrilled to have with us today Mr. Ron Rash, who is the author of Burning Bright, which is our read that we have for our entering students and for our entire college. And so we're very excited today to have him with us. And for those of you who are joining us, whether by phone or video, we're going to ask that you mute your mics so that we can have a good exchange today. We can hear Mr. Rash clearly, and then we will open up a session at the end for questions, and then you can unmute yourselves and join in and participate in the Q&A today. So I would like for Ms. Stacy Nichols to join me and to introduce Mr. Rash. Ms. Nichols.
Yes, ma'am. We are so pleased to have with us today Mr. Ron Rash. Mr. Rash was born in Chester, South Carolina, and earned his undergraduate degree from Gardner-Webb and master's degree from Clemson University. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller Serena, which was a 2009 PEN/Faulkner Award for Fiction finalist, and Above the Waterfall. Other prize-winning novels include The Cove, One Foot in Eden, Saints at the River, and The World Made Straight. Mr. Rash has also written 4 collections of poems and 6 collections of stories, including Chemistry and Other Stories, which was a finalist for the 2007 PEN/Faulkner Award, and Burning Bright, which won a 2010 Frank O'Connor International Story Award, and which Aiken Tech English 101 students read this year. Mr. Rash is a 2-time recipient of the O. Henry Prize, given annually to short stories of exceptional merit, and he has accumulated many other awards for his literary contributions. Mr. Rash and his wife Ann have 2 children. He teaches at Western Carolina University, where he serves as the John Paris Distinguished Professor in Appalachian Cultural Studies. Please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Mr. Ron Rash.
Well, thank you. I am so glad to be with you. I wish it were in person, but I have hopes that that will happen maybe in the fall or spring next year. We will talk about that later. But I'm so happy that the college chose my book. It's an honor, and particularly because I taught at a community college for 17 years. So one of the great things that's happened over the years for me is to see students, many of whom did not go immediately into college, I will see them teaching now. Several I've seen who are lawyers. I went to get a COVID shot, and I was given it to me by one of my students from Tri-County Tech. I was glad she made an A in my class, so that was good. But I thought what I would do, I really want to center this on your questions about the book, but I did want to start off telling you a little bit about myself, maybe a little bit about my journey to be a writer, to become a writer, and maybe inspire some of you to write your books. So I thought I would start with a story that had a huge impact on me. And it was actually a story probably many of you know. It's The Cat in the Hat. Probably some of you have read that when you were children or had it read to you. And I did as a child. My parents bought the book, and they would put me, in one, my mother's lap or my father's lap, and they would read it to me. And they'd read it to me seven or eight times. And one day, it was a Sunday, we were visiting my grandparents, and my mother and father were busy doing other things. So I asked my grandfather to read the book. And so he said he would do that. And I gave him the book. He put me in his lap, and he opened it up. And he started telling me about the cat in the hat. But what was interesting was that in his version, the cat was getting in a lot more trouble. And, the children were acting a little bit different. And it was in many ways a very different story from the one I had read to me 8 or 10 times. And the next time I was with him, I thought, I want to hear him read it. And he did. And the cat this time was, up to he was actually to the point where it looked like, the cat was going to be doing some serious jail time before this book ended. And I was fascinated with that. It was almost as if the words were kind of moving around and changing. And probably, as many of you have already maybe figured out, what was going on was my grandfather could not read or write. He had grown up on a farm in the North Carolina mountains, never really, or didn't have the opportunity really to go to school. But he was a very proud man, and he didn't want his grandson to know he couldn't read. But I thought that taught me a very valuable lesson about the use of imagination. But also, I think a lot of my writing is a way of honoring him, because he didn't have the opportunity to read and write. To honor my parents, my mom came off a farm near Boone, North Carolina, and actually, a lot of people don't know this, but my parents actually met not in the North Carolina mountains, but in Chester, South Carolina. My mother had come down there when she was about 16 to work in a cotton mill. She had finished high school. You only had to go, I think, 11 years then. So she was finished up. She came down looking for a job. My father, who had dropped out of high school by that time, was working in the mill, and they met and married. And actually, I was born, my first few years were in Chester before we moved back to Western North Carolina. My father decided to go back to school. Not first, he got a GED. He went back to school and got a GED because he dropped out, as I say, of high school. And then he decided he wanted to be a teacher. And he would work a shift at the mill, Springs Cotton Mill in Chester, and then would take a bus at night to Columbia to take night classes. He would study on the bus, on the way there and the way back. And I think that experience had a huge impact on me, as you might imagine, how hard he'd worked for that. My mother then, as an adult, she was in her 30s. She went back to school, got a college degree, and they both ended up being teachers. So I was very fortunate in that I grew up in a family that valued education. And I also, though, I was lucky in that my family had some really good stories to tell, particularly my grandmother. And I spent a lot of time with my grandmother when I was growing up in the North Carolina mountains. Stories about families. And the story Lincolnites in the book is actually based on something that happened to my family. There was during the Civil War, a lot of the people in the North Carolina mountains, including my family, fought and sympathized with the Union. I have two photographs of my family during the Civil War, and they both of the men are wearing Union uniforms. But that area where my mother grew up, where my grandmother's farm was, during the Civil War, my ancestor had gone off to fight for the Union, gone to Tennessee, and then left his wife, who was still a teenager, had a child already, another one coming, and she was alone on that farm. They had one horse, and one afternoon, a man came up from, well, she didn't know exactly where, probably from Boone, and claimed to be in the Confederate Army. Now, there's very good possibility he wasn't. He may have just been in a sense, a thief taking the advantage of this opportunity. And he came and he actually did take the horse. And my ancestor, and I come from a long line of strong women, very bravely, as the man was leaving, he was whistling Dixie. And she said, "You'll be whistling Dixie in hell by morning." And the next morning, I mean, all this is historically true. About a mile down the road toward Boone, that man was found murdered, face down in a creek. And, in the story, probably that was done by some of the older men in the community. They probably killed him because the next morning the horse was back in the stable where it had been taken from, or the barn. So, but I thought this is where I think short stories and where they come from me. Sometimes they will come from something I've heard, sometimes an image. But in this instance, I knew there was a fascinating story there, but I wanted to ratchet it up and make it more, in a way, more about her. And so, in the story, she actually is the one who kills the man. So that's kind of where I think that's what's fun about writing fiction, that I can take an event, sometimes maybe a story, and I hope that I can make it a little more interesting, or I want to take it in a very unexpected direction. And that story is actually one that happened with, and it probably is not very clear. It meant more to me probably than to the reader, but the first story, Hard Times, takes place on that same road. And that road, 2 Mile Road, is one that I spent so much time on. So many of my relatives lived there. And so the book, in a sense, begins and ends on that same road, different period. And in the middle of the book, there's also a third story that was based on my uncle, the story Return, who, when I was a child, I remember he was a very gentle, kind man. And I remembered when I would go to his house, he was a hunter, so he had 3 or 4 rifles, or maybe 3 or 4 rifles, shotgun. But he had them racked near the door. But there was one of them that was very different, its color, because it was a kind of orange color, a different kind of wood. And I can't remember exactly how old I was, but it turned out that had been the rifle of a Japanese sniper during World War II. My uncle had been passing through, a very dense area, a jungle, and a sniper had shot, and the bullet actually hit his helmet, knocked the helmet off. He recovered enough to shoot and kill the man. And that was the gun. And that gun had always haunted me. But even more so, I think what haunted me was that he had gone off to war and, survived. And the story to me was about coming home. And I would think, this is all imagination, but I just imagine him being in this really hot tropical area, coming from the mountains, what that would feel like, having this moment where he, kills a man, has to kill a man. A man's trying to kill him. But once again, the connection, I thought, where the story might be interesting, where I wanted to take it to another level, was when he sees the cross. Because one thing that sometimes people don't realize is that there was a significant number of Christians in Japan during that time. And I think that's one of the most horrific things about war, is that people who very often have a lot in common, unfortunately, end up fighting each other. And this really came back to me during Vietnam, when I have a cousin. My closest cousin was 2 years older than I was. I just missed that period, that draft period. He was sent off to Vietnam, farm boy, wasn't going to college, and he, family wasn't poor. I mean, they were pretty poor, or at least lower economically. And he went off there and fought. But I read a book a few years later by a writer or a while later, actually, by a man who, about a North Korean soldier. And it was the same story, that his family, he was talking about the fact that even, with the Communist Party in North Vietnam, that Vietnam, the leaders' children even there, were not the ones that would go into the war. It was once again the poor, very often, the farmers, and so that just kind of struck me that probably in many ways, so many of the people my cousin was fighting, and they were fighting him, and yet there were connections there, and so that's the particular story. I felt like I wanted to establish that in some degree of empathy between with that man, not refusing just to not view him as a human being. And I think one thing that literature can do is kind of remind us of those connections. So that's kind of a background, a little bit about my family. I think as a writer, the way I became a writer, some of it, I think, was that stunning moment when I realized my grandfather couldn't read. That happened, as I got older. But I loved to read, but also I was very comfortable being by myself. And I think most writers are introverts. I spent so much time when I was young on my grandmother's farm. Very often it'd just be she and I would be the only ones there, and no vehicle, so we couldn't go anywhere really except walking. But it gave me a chance to I love to wander the woods. I love to fish. I love to hunt. My uncles took me hunting. I didn't do as much of that, but I could fish, particularly when I was there by myself. But I spent a lot of time out daydreaming. I heard stories from older relatives. I heard their dialect. And one thing I love about dialects is that particularly when they're of a particular region, whether the Appalachian dialect, the Gullah dialect on the coast of South Carolina, a lot of times people think that language is unsophisticated, but they're wrong. They're wrong. What you start to see, if you study it carefully, you will see an attentiveness to the natural world, and you'll also see something that I think is really something that I try to do in my work when I have characters. Very much like a lot of my ancestors. My uncles didn't go to college, not one of them, but they were very intelligent men. But what a folk language can do very often is the intelligence of the people by the similes, the kind of metaphorical use of language. Because you have to be an intelligent person to make a connection between two things that are not alike. And I can remember, and if you look at, as I say, you look at folk languages, you will see this. You will see this if you really, and you listen to them. And also one thing I found about folk languages is just a delight in saying something in a memorable way. So the best example is actually one that happened when I was about 16. My uncle, who was a tobacco farmer, probably had, I don't know, maybe a 5th grade education, probably. But obviously a very intelligent man. And if you've ever tried to grow tobacco, that is a demanding job. I mean, you have to know what you're doing to grow tobacco. But we were in the nearest town, and he was going to the hardware store, and I was with him. And there was a young woman, this was summertime, walking toward us on the sidewalk. And she was rather scantily clad by my uncle's standards. And very short shorts, and of course I was looking at her. I was about 16, and he saw me, and he said, "That girl hasn't got enough clothes on to wad a shotgun." Now, if you think about that, the idea of enough clothes to wad a shotgun is going to be about a piece of cloth about like that, and it was brilliant. I mean, because he was taking these two things that we would never think of being connected, and suddenly they are, and it's in a way that is so vivid and memorable, and that to me is what, and sophisticated. It's sophisticated. So that was a great lesson, and it's interesting. I loved him saying that. I knew I was going to use that. I kept trying to get it into a short story or novel. I wanted a character to say that. And finally, in my 3rd novel, a novel called The World Made Straight, I was able to have a character say it. And I was so happy, to get him in there. But one thing I've tried to do in my writing and in Burning Bright is to kind of show the intelligence of the people through their similes and their metaphors. I want to show, as I say, a delight in language and a memorable phrasing. So I think all of those things tie into Burning Bright. And the title, I suspect some of you have talked about it in class. One view I'll give you as the writer, that doesn't necessarily always mean it's the right view, because I found sometimes I put things in books I didn't realize are there, but they are there. I thought a lot about William Blake's poem Burning Bright, but I also thought about what he says in the line after that, in the forest of the night. And I put in Burning Bright, most of these characters are in really tough situations, yet at the same time, with most of them, not all of them, most of them are finding some kind of inner brightness, something, hope, courage, decency, and trying to bring that out. So sometimes people say I'm kind of a depressing writer, but I don't think I am. I think what I try to do is to put characters in situations where they find out, and the reader finds out, what's their essence. What happens when you strip people down to the core? And you find this out in real life. I mean, you don't find out who your friends are until something happens that, a parent dies, something goes terribly wrong in your life. That's when you find out who your friends are, and also you find out about who you are. So I think as a way of maybe starting the discussion, I hope that's a good way. And I really, as I say, I prefer just making this a conversation where I answer some questions about the book.
That is an excellent start, because I know that some of the questions that my students had to do with the inspiration for the stories. So that's really neat to hear about. And I'm thrilled to hear about the allusion to the Blake poem, because we talked about that, and we noted the little detail too of the lighter in that story with the title on it. So it's really neat to hear those connections. I think another specific question that my students had asked was, we really liked the story, The Woman Who Believed in Jaguars. And that one actually may have been my favorite in the collection. But my students kind of raised the question. They were like, I mean, this is happening in a very familiar place to us. It's the zoo in Columbia. I think most of us have been there. But in terms of setting, that was a really different place than the other stories. So we wondered if you would comment a little bit about the thematic connection that connects that story to the others.
Yeah, well, I felt like you're right. Much less than geographical, but much more thematically, I think the story fits in. And you're right. And it's interesting because people who know my work well, including my brother, who's in many ways my best reader, and we've all known, and I felt that story has always felt very different from any other story I've written. It may be a matter of tone. Part of it is setting. But I just felt like it needed to, for whatever reason, it needed to be in South Carolina. And in some ways, because I have lived in South Carolina, so I have a connection there, and I've lived in Clemson, a good part of my life. So, but yeah, I think you're right. It is a story that's a little bit out, and I think, but I felt like it needed to be there. And maybe part of what it does is it allows readers who may not know the North Carolina mountains well, as you say, to kind of enter the book on that level where, yeah, this is a place I'm familiar with. This is a landscape I'm familiar with. And that's my hope. Yeah, and it sounds like maybe that happened for some students. But yeah, it is a very different story. It's in some ways, I think, a mystical story. I really believe she has some kind of beautiful revelation at the end. I do not see it as a depressing story. And I think we sense something has something good has happened to her. I mean, or a kind of acceptance of her life that she didn't have before. I mean, the fact that she's able to sleep after so long being unable to. But yeah, that's actually several people, that's their favorite story I've ever written. It's kind of interesting. Some people, that story seems to be one that, and maybe because it is in some ways so different, it's singular in my work. Yeah.
I think you're right. And I will add, I noticed that Ms. Johnson posted in the chat as well. If anyone has questions that they would like to post in the chat, please feel free to do that. And meanwhile, I have a couple other questions as well. Or if you would prefer to unmute yourself and ask a question, that is also fine. But let me add one more that my students have asked of me often. They ask us about Burning Bright, but they ask it in general sometimes about the things that they feel that I force them to read. So I'm sure you can relate a little bit as an instructor, that sometimes students are like, oh, why do we have to read this? And one question that I get a lot is, why is it that things that get classified as literature in general don't have kind of happy, neat endings? And we've had some discussions about that, but I would be interested to hear your perspective.
Okay. Well, I agree. I think that literature is something that's not important to us until we need it. And when we really need it, perhaps most, and I'm not saying for everyone, it is when those moments when we feel that something's happened, our lives have gone in directions we wish they hadn't, some tragedy perhaps has happened. And if literature, one possibility of literature is that I think it helps us to feel less alone. There's a sense that maybe somebody else has felt what I'm feeling. It's not that, it's almost not so much a revelation as a recognition that you hope that in some ways a writer might be able to convey a kind of feeling that the reader might connect with. But I think one reason that so much quote unquote literature is sometimes very serious, sometimes very about people in very troubling situations is kind of what I brought up earlier. What I want to do in my stories, particularly in this book, I want to kind of strip down people to where we're just seeing, a kind of unexposed heart. I mean, we're going into the deepest level, and in life, we know we all so often wear masks. We're not the people that other people may think we are, and the other people we see we may misjudge too. But there are those incredible moments when we suddenly realize somebody, sometimes in a very sad way when somebody betrays us, sometimes in a very positive way when someone surprises us in a way that really we wouldn't have thought them to be capable of, in a good way. So those things, I think that's one of the reasons. And I think it's interesting, when I taught at the community college, the older the students were, the more they got it. Because they had lived, and I think part of life is very joyous, and I think of myself as a pretty happy person. A lot of people are surprised at that, but we all ultimately are going to face some tough, hard times, and in those times, maybe it helps to have a sense that a story kind of reminds us that this is part of just being a human being. I will say, and I might choke up a little bit with this, but I'm going to bring it up because it's an important question. When my father died, he died young, my grandmother, the first thing she asked when I called her to tell her, I couldn't, I was going to drive down there, but I had to call her first. And I was the oldest in the family, and my father was an only child. So I called, and she said, you've got to make sure it's in the newspaper. And I mean, that was the first thing that she said. And you know, just a couple of minutes later, she said, "You've got to get it in the newspaper." And at first, that it kind of bothered me. I thought, well, you know, that's not the most important thing now. It's really not. But then I remembered a short story by William Faulkner called "Go Down Moses." Very short story in that collection. And in the story, there's this old woman, a grandmother. She's maybe late 70s, maybe early 80s. And she's raised this child to, you know, late teens. The child goes to Chicago and actually ends up murdering someone and ultimately dying himself. And the body has been brought back to a little town in Mississippi where the grandmother lives. And the grandmother goes to the newspaper office and says, "You've got to put this in the paper." And the newspaper reporter thinks, sure, you know, he's thinking, well, what, you know, this guy was, you know, executed. He murdered someone. Why, you know, wouldn't you kind of want to keep this quiet? But what you learn as you get toward the end of the story is that this woman has done everything she could to raise this child. She has raised this child alone. He's gone off. He's gotten in trouble. But the last thing she can do to honor him is to make the world acknowledge his death. And my point being, as I was thinking about my grandmother, that story flashed in my head, and I understood immediately what was going on. And I think without that story, I would hope that I would have been aware, and I think I would have figured it out eventually, but it was almost like a lightning bolt, because that story had never been like, you know, one of my favorite short stories, but I realized that it hit something really true about a woman of that kind of generation, maybe, but also how, you know, that this is ultimately the core of love that's being revealed.
I love your use of that word "true," because I think that is a discussion that we often have about literature, which is this is not factual, but it reveals a kind of truth that we can relate to as human beings. So I think that's a great connection to think about, and definitely when we think about the darkness and complexity of life, you know, and the way that we find those little glimmers of joy, that's very true to the human experience. So I'm interested to see, and I noticed, Marlena, I think earlier I couldn't tell if you were raising your hand or applauding, because I'm still a little bit new to Collaborate. So did you have a question as well? Okay, excellent. I thought you all could applaud.
Well, you know, we have a little bit of time, and like I said, we really do our best to work. Oh, sorry.
No problem. So I'm interested if there are other attendees that have questions. If you'd like to type them in the chat or raise your hand or unmute yourself, we certainly welcome any questions or thoughts. So I'll make sure I have the chat in front of me in case there are others.
Miss Nichols, this is
Yes.
Forrest Van. How are you?
I am well. How are you?
Good. Mr. Rash, I'm the president of Aiken Technical College, and I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be here with us today for this Dynamic Dialogues series. This ties in with our QEP, correct, Ms. Nichols? And so therefore, this is something that's going to be in the next 5 years. And as you know, having worked at Tri-County and also working at North Carolina College, you know all about the SAC-COC process. So
oh, yes.
So they were very careful and selective in what book they chose for this project. And Dr. Burdett, I believe, and a fellow Tri-County tech instructor at one day, now our Vice President for Academic and Student Affairs, knew of you and recommended you. So we want to thank you for being with us. And I think that our department has gotten a lot of use of your skills and your talent. Thank you.
Well, thank you. You've got a great staff. Everyone's worked really well in setting this up. I'm not very good with computers and technology, but everyone's kind of helped me get through that. So thank you.
Well, and I'll just echo that and say that we're delighted to have you. And indeed, I think this has been a year of lots of folks getting better at computers and technology. So
I've had to.
we're all making progress for sure. I see Dr. Burdett raising his hand, so I will recognize you. If you'd just like to unmute yourself, that's fine.
Yes, I will, and thank you again for being with us today. And Dr. Mahan mentioned that you and I had worked together at Tri-County Technical College, and I remember something you said, and this was many, many years ago, but you were describing to me how much time you allocate each week to writing, and that I have never forgotten that, and I think it might be helpful for some of our attendees just to listen to you talk about the time that you dedicate to your craft.
Yeah, well, that's a good question, because I think a lot of times, and it's so good to be with Vincent again. We had he was great. We had a great team at Tri-County, and I think we had a really good staff, really good teachers there. So that was good. That was a very good time. But yeah, I found that the easiest thing to do is to find an excuse not to write. And I would hope that in a way I might inspire students today, because I can tell you that when I did not write I wasn't and I'm not proud of this, but I was not a particularly good high school student. I wasn't. I'm not being humble here. I wasn't. But I'd always loved to read. But when I decided, when I was in my 20s, I decided I wanted to be a writer. I'd actually been a pretty good athlete. I'd run high school track. Actually got a scholarship and ran in college. I actually continued to run. I was actually training seriously to get my time down. I was getting fairly close in 800 meters to qualify for the Olympic trials. Now, I'd have been knocked out in the first round. There's no way I'd have made the Olympic team, but that was kind of my goal. But I pulled a hamstring, and suddenly I had all of this energy that I'd had as an athlete, all the discipline, the idea of training 9 months sometimes for the track season. I ran track, cross country, but that wasn't what I was really about. I was about 800 meters. And I just kind of moved all of that into writing, as you say. And so what I did was I didn't rely on this idea of writers being inspired. Instead, I viewed it more like farm work. It's kind of like either you're driving the mule or you are the mule. You just kind of got to keep going, put your head down those long rows. But I did. Even at Tri-County, what I did was I pretty much put in, I tried to get in 3-4 hours a day, every day, even when I was teaching. And one thing you may remember, Vincent, is I actually taught night classes so I could free up the mornings or part of the morning to write. But I tend to write, and since then, I pretty much will get in 4 hours, pretty much minimum, almost every day. I will, some days when it's really going well, I'll write 8 or 10 hours. But my point being, it's like anything else you really want to be good at. I put in the time. I wrote a number of stories that if anybody'd seen them, they would have said, there's no way this person has enough ability to write a good story. I actually had people tell me that, but I didn't want to give up. And I think that's the part that people forget, is that, it's like if you're really, really good, to be a really, really good guitarist, really good athlete, basketball player, you've got to put in the time and the discipline, and you've got to focus. And I did those things. And but it didn't come easy. I didn't really start getting much. I didn't publish my first book till I was in about 40. I've been writing pretty hard, pretty seriously for about 15 years. So yeah, but that's the part I think people sometimes forget, and I think a lot of times with anything writing, whether it's in a 101 class or 102 class or any time, is that, well, if you don't ever do it, how are you going to get good at it? And I think you have to practice. You can't, I do usually about 15 drafts of everything I write. And actually, I've done about 12 drafts on something I'm working on right now. And I didn't plan to show this. I'd actually been working on it right before, but I don't know if you can see this. But you will see there is a lot I've already gotten wrong. All of those are changes I'm making on this one page. And this is something I've been over probably 12 times. So when your teachers say you need to do drafts, students, they're telling the truth. I actually ran out and started writing on the back, you know. So I've pretty much written as much as I had on the page originally. And that's 12 drafts in.
Yes, I love that advice, and I think that's fantastic to share with students. And absolutely, I mean, it's a process. It's not the sort of magic moment that you've got it, you know, but it's a process that takes time. I want to recognize two questions. There's one in the chat from Simon Grant that says, "How do you approach short stories and novels differently, and how do you choose whether or not to develop an idea into a short story or a novel?"
Oh, that's an excellent question. It really is. And I also write poetry, so I kind of do all three. But what I've found is that actually, I believe, and most writers I know would agree, writing a good short story is harder than writing a good novel. And that may surprise some people, but I think a really good one. And part of what the reason for that is that with a short story, almost every line has to work. You've got such a small space to create a character and try to make a character memorable. And in a way, I think it's closer to writing a poem than a novel because everything has to be so concise. You have to find maybe that one detail that says so much about a character. So that's the challenge. The novel, very different. Novels are, Henry James said that a novel was a loose, baggy monster. And what he meant by that was that you can throw all sorts of things in there. And very often that's sometimes the most interesting part for a reader. You know, maybe a lot of historical detail or maybe how someone would build a boat and, all sorts of things. But they are very different, but what's interesting is why one becomes a novel, why one becomes a poem, why one, becomes a short story. And almost, I would say, probably 3 or 4 of my novels have begun as short stories. Actually, several began as poems. And the third novel I wrote, The World Made Straight, is centered on a 17-year-old young man who gets into some trouble with, pretty serious trouble with some drug dealers. And I wrote the short story. The short story was called Speckled Trout, and it was published, actually won an O. Henry Award, which I was very happy about. And I felt like I was through with that character. And at the end of the story, it was another, bleak Ron Rash story. The young man actually is killed. But, as a year or so passed, I started feeling kind of guilty because he was just 17. He'd done a stupid thing. He'd stolen from these people. But, I think most of us, or I'll speak for myself, when I did some unwise things when I was 17, not to that degree, but what struck me was I kind of felt guilty that I'd killed him. And so I've decided to write a whole novel, and in the novel he lives. So I kind of resurrected him. But it was to the point being that even when I finished the short story, and this also happened with my first and second novels, that there was something that I knew hadn't been said. I knew that there was a deeper or more of a story here. And even though the short story I felt like was a good story, it held up well, I knew that these characters were calling me back to do more. And actually, my fourth novel, a novel called Serena, was, I thought that would be a book I would never come back to, but my last book, I actually have a novella where I kind of go back to those characters. And so, yeah, you know, it's a very different experience, short story to novel. But I found that usually they will. I don't think I've ever thought I had a novel and then decided it was a short story. It's usually the other way around.
That's really interesting to hear about the process, and especially to hear about the demands of a short story in contrast to a novel. I noticed, I think Dr. Simmons, you have your hand up. Did you have a question?
Just wanted to share real quick. I want to thank Aiken Technical College for selecting that book. My son, St. Oldest son Nathan, was a first-time freshman last fall and still is at Aiken Tech and took English 101. What was great was that he would always come to me and share the stories that he was reading and want to talk about them, which was, you know, it provided a chance for he and I to have some deeper, meaningful conversations, specifically the one with the Japanese sniper rifle. And it was kind of funny. At first, he didn't realize it was a flashback. So we talked about some of those things, or just really the difference between the settings of a cold, you know, mountain and the hot jungles of the Pacific. And so I really enjoyed the stories he would share. It gave me a chance to really talk at a deeper level than we've had in a while. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And I would also, I think that's one of the great things about short stories is that in some ways they're more open to those kinds of questions, those interpretations. You know, sometimes it's almost as if the short story is like a Rorschach test. It tells you more about yourself, the way you view a character. I mean, I suspect there are people who read Hard Times and were, you know, somewhat sympathetic, maybe even to Hartley, you know, but to to different characters. And I think short stories in a way maybe demand in some ways more from the reader, in the sense that, you know, there's a lot of space for the reader to connect. But I'm glad those worked. And yeah, and you know, that actually brings up a really good point about what I did with time in the book. I wanted the reader, as the reader went through the stories, to at times almost feel like, well, I don't even know what century I'm in at first, and then it becomes revealed. I wanted that to be almost like a kind of rhythm in the book. You know, we're kind of weaving through time, but geography is a kind of time, if you think about it, because Aiken in 1900, completely different kind of place. I mean, in almost every conceivable way, and so that fascinates me, how a place such as, for me, the Southern Appalachian Mountains shifts through time, and yet at the same time we see the connections, and I hope that human nature really doesn't change all that much. The circumstances do, but essentially people tend to, you know, be human, you know, and it just, you know, and I hope that those connections are clear. Yeah.
I love that idea of thinking about geography as a kind of time, because I think that is something that's really striking about those stories, and strikes me too about Woman Who Believed in Jaguars, actually, you know, and that idea of, could there have been jaguars at one time? So I think that's really neat. I noticed Melissa Johnson has her hand raised as well.
Yes, Mr. Rash, you mentioned folk languages, and my family, we have roots in South Carolina. And so I'm interested in the Gullah languages, and I'm interested to hear how you may have incorporated some of those languages into some of your writings, particularly if there are any books that I could, you know, get a hold of that may speak to those languages.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I think part of what I want to do, and I think there are writers, I'm sure, who are doing this, is you want to preserve that language and honor it. And so, you know, my hope is that with Gullah, with Appalachian, the kind of French Creole or Cajun dialects, I mean, I love those dialects, and you know, there's a, you know, serious preservation attempts with the Cherokee language near where I teach. And so I think those things are very important to preserve. So yes, you know, we need to keep those alive. Yeah. You know, it's interesting. I mentioned Japan, that story, and my books have been translated now into 17 languages, and it's interesting. But I think it does kind of connect that that we're ultimately writing about human beings, and I actually thought you might find this a little interesting. You can't really tell. This is just one I just picked up, but if you turn over, you'll see that this is my novel Serena. My fourth novel, but it's in Chinese, and it's really been kind of wonderful to to have those books translated. This one, actually, another novel that came out in France, and I got an email actually from Dubai. And it's wonderful to think that I can write about kind of some of these family stories, but also stories of this region that a lot of people don't know a lot about, and that maybe they can connect to people from other places.
That is. Thank you for sharing those. And I see another question from Crystal Ratliff.
Hello, Mr. Rash. So I don't really have a question as much as I would just like to offer a comment, but I'm also from the Appalachian Hills, and I just wanted to take a moment to say to you, I appreciate your work in carrying these stories to a broader audience. And I especially thank you for your connection of the metaphors and the brilliance of these people and how creative they are. So just thank you for being here, and keep up the good work. We really appreciate it.
Well, where did you grow up?
In southeastern Ohio.
Okay, yeah, that is Appalachia, and actually some really good writers are coming from that area. I don't know if you've read Donald Ray Pollock, but he writes about that area and does it. He's pretty gritty, but okay. I think he writes really well, and but yeah. That region, I think, and as you know, I mean, there are a lot of stereotypes about the people.
Sure.
And I think part of what I want to do with my work is I don't want to sentimentalize these people. I'm not going to pretend they're better or they're, but I'm not going to demonize them either. But I'm going to try to show them, complex, I hope I achieve a level of complexity that, and I think that's the goal when we're writing. So I'm glad they ring true.
Yes. Thank you so much.
It looks like we have another question from Elena, which is, what methods do you use to research communities or areas that readers may not be familiar with in order to properly convey them in your stories?
Okay, yeah, that's a very good question, because I do love to do research, and I find things out that are just so incredible that I couldn't have made them up when I do research. So that's great. But yeah, I study oral histories. I read about the plant life. I read about the animal life. I'm actually even more interested in that. So yeah, and because what I'm trying to do is, I think the reader very often has to believe the small things to believe the big lie that's a story. I mean, for instance, if I said a story in Aiken, South Carolina, and I have someone go to a farm pond and catch a blue marlin, the readers probably immediately, or most readers, are going, no, you don't catch a blue marlin in a farm pond outside Aiken. Now, if I have that character catch a largemouth bass, we might believe that. So, yeah, but I do love doing the research. And one thing that's kind of, actually in my fourth novel, Serena, I had a really fascinating experience where I took an idea. I was trying to make the character whose name is Serena, I wanted to do something that would make her seem almost mythical. This is the book set in the 1930s. So I had her train. I thought, well, could I have her train an eagle to hunt rattlesnakes? I mean, that was just this weird idea that came to my head. And I thought, could I make that believable? And I really wasn't sure, but I thought, wow, if I could, that would really be fascinating. So I actually did enough research to where I was able to talk to one of the 12 people in the United States who hunted with an eagle, a man out in Wyoming. And he took this very seriously. And he said, yeah, I think you could do this. And then, of course, I said, well, how? And we actually would exchange emails. We had conversations. One night I kept thinking my phone was dying because I heard a chirping. And it turned out the eagle lived in his house. And so, yeah, you know, learning those things and trying to put them in the books. You know, sometimes I'll get a little something wrong and people will remind me. But I try, it's part, and I think the other thing that ties into this is I think people, even when we read fiction, we love to learn about things we don't know. I mean, what would it be like to be a logger in the Appalachian Mountains, 1930s? What would it, you know, what would a man be wearing in 1860s? You know, what kind of clothing in a story such as Lincolnites? What might someone who's very poor make a living from, as in a story like Hard Times? You know, so yeah, I think though I didn't have to research that because my mother actually did that during the Depression. She actually did gather Galax and they would sell it, and ginseng too.
That's so amazing to hear about those connections and the neat conversations that you get to have about eagles hunting rattlesnakes and other things. That's really neat. I'm looking to see if we have any more questions, and I don't see any in the chat. Are there any other questions for now before I turn it over to Ms. Johnson? Okay, well, in that case, Ms. Johnson, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Nichols, for being our moderator for our Q&A session. Thank you again, Mr. Rash, for joining us. It has been our treat and our pleasure. We can't wait to do it again, as we've already discussed. I would like to ask Dr. Mahan and or Dr. Burdett if they have any closing comments you would like to add for today.
Well, thank you, Melissa. As I said, Mr. Rash, thank you for your time and your efforts. We're getting a great deal out of your talent, and I appreciate what you've had to offer. And also, we hope you can come visit us in person in the not too distant future.
Well, we're working on that right as we speak. So I hope that will be a possibility. I'd love to come to Aiken. Actually, one of my best friends lives down there and works at the Savannah River site. So it'd be great to see him as well.
Well, very good. We look forward to having you here. Okay.
Well, thank you. It's been a good session, and thank you for choosing the book.
And speaking of old friends, Ron, it's great to see you. Thank you again for being willing to join us today, and just wishing you all the best, and can't wait to read some more of your works.
Well, thank you. And, you know, the allergies are getting bad up here. I mean, you know, my eyes have been watering all day. I don't know if you could tell that. It's not tears, you know. But thank you. Yes.
Well, thank you again, and thank you everyone for joining us. The video of today's presentation will be available on YouTube very soon, so look for that posting and that announcement, and look for the opportunity to join us for Dynamic Dialogues, our series. We have 4 guest lectures every year, and of course, having Mr. Rash with us was the highlight of this year. So look for more details in the future. Thank you all for joining us, and have an awesome, awesome day. Thank you again, Mr. Rash.
Thank you. Y'all did a great job.
Thank you so much. It is wonderful to see you, and we look forward to meeting again, hopefully in person.
All right. That sounds great. Y'all have a good day.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay. Bye.